Welcome to this second keynote lecture at the 41st Symposium of the Spanish Economic Association. My name is Juan Jimeno, and I am Vice President of the Spanish Economic Association. And on this occasion, it is a great pleasure for me to introduce Nagore Iriberri, who is going to deliver this keynote lecture. Nagore was born a few years ago in the Basque country, although not quite in Bilbao, this great town where everybody should be born in. She completed undergraduate studies in communication and economics at the University of the Basque country, and then a PhD in economics at the University of California in San Diego. Her dissertation was about strategic behavior in very complicated settings like level K auctions and hide and seek games. Let me tell you that hide and seek games are those in which one player wins by matching the action of the other player, while this wins by separating from the other player. So when reading through the paper yesterday, it came to my mind that maybe the main reason why Donald Trump is about to be elected president of the US is because Hillary Clinton did not read Nagore's dissertation. Two other chapters for Nagore were very soon published, one in Econometrica and another in the American Economic Review. This is quite of an achievement, but I am not sure that it is a blessing, because how can you improve after that? What else can you do? Well, in fact, Nagore has very much improved and performed outstanding research in applied game theory and experimental economics, touching upon issues such as the importance of performance feedback information, the role of role uncertainty in modified detector games, and how to promote rule compliance in daily life. More recently, she has turned into gender issues. She has a very interesting paper with Ghazala Ahmad and Caterina Casalmiglia on gender differences in responses to big stakes, and also several working papers on other differences in strategic behavior between men and women. Nagore's academic positions were always in Spain, first at the University Pompeu Fabra, and then as an Iberbax research professor at the University of the Basque Countries. And a few months ago, she was awarded the prize Fundación Banco Sabadell to economic research, which recognizes the research achievement of the best Spanish economists under the age of 40. Today, Nagore is going to tell us about gender differences and gender interaction effects in bargaining. I guess this is a very important topic where many of us have a lot of evidence, also not much knowledge, particularly those like me who end up losing all the domestic negotiations. So I am eager to listen to Nagore, and I'm pretty sure that we all learn a lot from her presentation. So please, Nagore.
Okay, so thank you very much for the introduction. I should start saying thank you very much for the invitation, Natalia. And maybe I should also explain that the very first time I got the offer, I said, I think you can find better candidates. Now that you know all my age, I said I'm too young and my CV is not thick enough. But then I started to think as an economist, and Rafael yesterday said that the association is poor, and I'm local. So I'm a very attractive candidate in that dimension. So here I am, but anyway, thank you very much for the opportunity to actually be here and give this talk. So today I'm going to be talking about gender differences and gender interaction effects in bargaining. And I should start saying that this is joint work with a very good student of mine, Íñigo Hernández Arena, who is actually on the market. So let me start motivating the gender differences, and especially when people ask me, non-economists ask me, so why economists care about gender differences? I always say that I think the main motivation for looking at gender differences is because still, if you look at labor market outcomes, men and women find or obtain very different outcomes. So taking the latest report from OECD countries, and again, saying that, that there has been a big progress, still men and women obtain different outcomes in labor market outcomes in 3 dimensions at least. Men and women participate very differently, so the participation rate is different. Also, there are important gender differences in segregation, both horizontally across sectors and fields, but also in the vertical dimension. If you look at the managing or responsibility dimension, still men and women hold very different types of positions. And one piece of evidence that basically captures the interest of the media is the gender wage gap. Okay, so controlling for human capital or education, but also job characteristics, men and women still get a different wage, and on average, this is of 15%. Of difference. So this is important, okay? So now how do we economists basically look at that, or how can we explain that? And I think it's commonly agreed that there has been a shift in 2 directions in the last years. So the first direction would be there has been a shift in the topics or in the main explanations that have been studied or considered, but also there has been a change or shift in the methodology that people have used in order to study the importance of these main explanations, okay? So if you look at the Handbook of Labor Economics, and if you look at the gender chapter, so in 1999, for example, Donji and Blanc basically say, well, still discrimination is a big important explanation. But again, the most difficult thing about discrimination is that if you look at the field, it's really hard to identify, okay? Now, if you look at the respective chapter in 2011 by Marianne Bertrand, there are the main, I'm not going to say maybe the main explanations, but explanations based on behavioral differences or psychological aspects have gained quite a lot of interest and attention, okay? And with that, also more field and lab experiments also have gotten quite a lot of prominence, okay? So let me go in that direction, given it's closer to my topic and research field. And let me ask basically, so what have we learned from behavioral economics, okay? So what have we learned from lab or field experiments in those aspects? And if there is one experimental paper or 2 that have gotten quite a lot of citations and quite a lot of interest and attention, are those that look or find evidence of gender differences in what it has been called competitiveness, okay? And in that aspect, there are 2 papers. The first one found that men and women basically perform differently if you change the underlying incentive schemes from piece rate to competition, okay? So they use a between-subject design, very simple design. They have men and women performing a particular task, and when they are paid according to piece rate, they find no significant differences, so men and women basically perform equally or similarly. But when the underlying incentive schemes change from piece rate to competition, then gender differences appear, and in particular, men outperform women, okay? The follow-up paper got even more attention, and they don't talk about people's differences when performing. They talk about differences in choosing over different incentive schemes, okay? So don't force people to perform under different incentive schemes. Just give them the choice, okay? So what Nederland and Westerlund do is, within subject analysis, they ask people, men and women, basically do a task under piece rate. do the same task under competition, and the third time, before they actually do the task, they say, well, how do you want to be paid? Okay? So when the option is given, it turns out that men and women show quite different preferences, and in particular, women shy away from competitive environments. Okay? So this is the main, these are the two papers that actually got quite a lot of attention. Now, if you think about it, the follow-up studies went, I believe, in two directions. In one direction is, well, how robust is this? Okay, and the second direction is, okay, this has been found in the lab, but can we find some evidence in the field without, so at the end of the day, it's basically questioning the external validity, okay? So is there anything out there in the field that we can exploit in order to see that this is actually true, or this has some empirical relevance? And in that direction, I have worked with Pedro Reibiel in actually both types of directions, okay? Also, a little bit of what we have learned. We have also learned that maybe men and women react differently to pressure, okay? And there are different types of pressures. But one particular could be that maybe when the stakes are high, okay? So maybe when the stakes are low, there is no such a big difference, but what about when the stakes are high? And in that aspect, I have some work with Ghazal Asmat and Caterina Calsamiglia that basically show that there might be some gender differential reaction to that, okay? And in general, I think we have learned from behavioral economics and also from laboratory and field experiments that men and women have or show differences in differences in preferences, okay? In particular, risk preferences, social preferences, and also away from preferences in confidence, okay? And I think the main thing that we have learned is that men and women indeed show differences in risk aversion. Women tend to be more risk averse. If you ask me about the actual magnitude, I would say it depends on the actual elicitation method you use, okay? Regarding social preferences, I think this is less clear because it really depends on the actual environment or setting or even game used in order to elicit these differences. So it's really context dependent, so it's not that useful in that sense or that robust. And I think here the main question overall, I think about all this, I think where the literature is going is really, okay, we have learned all this in the lab, but is there any evidence in which we can actually link all these differences elicited in the lab with actual labor market outcomes? And I think there are some important papers nowadays that go in that direction. So how informative, how useful is all these differences when actually explaining and linking to the actual labor market outcomes, okay? And the typical thing here would be basically to have students, graduate students maybe having elicited all these measures and then following them afterwards in the labor market, okay? But today, I will talk about something different, and I think because there is much more to do, and this has to do with gender differences and gender interaction effects in bargaining. Okay, so this is the thing that I want to talk about today. Okay, so bargaining is quite important if you actually look or think how initial salaries are stated or determined, okay? Because bargaining plays an important role in those. And also, if you think of the career path, I mean, pay increases are many times negotiated, okay? So in that sense, bargaining might play an important role in explaining some of the gender differences in, for example, salaries. Ghazal Asmat and Barbara Petrangolo summarize it very well, saying bargaining behavior may shed light on within job disparities and career progression, and in that sense, I think it's very useful or relevant particularly for the gender wage gap. Okay, so I think it has potentially something to say on that. Okay, so what do we know? So what has been done? And I think if I ask you, what do you know about gender differences in bargaining? I think almost everybody has heard of the book by Babcock and Lachever titled Women Don't Ask. And I think it's an interesting book to read, but I think the most useful or the nicest illustration that the book contains is this survey that they did to Carnegie Mellon University graduates. And they found that male and female students actually got different initial salaries. But it turns out that when she asked, or when they asked, so whether they negotiated or not that particular offer or that particular salary, only 7% of women did negotiate, and 57% of men did. Okay, so they found that this difference, this gender difference, was quite striking. Okay, very recently, Leibrand and List have a field experiments in which they post jobs, they advertise jobs, and they have two main treatments. So they have jobs in which clearly it is stated that wages are negotiable, and they have another control in which they have that they don't say anything about that. So it turns out that it matters, and it matters in the following way. When it's stated that wages are negotiable, men and women are equally likely to actually start a negotiation. But when it's not stated, or it's kind of left in the ambiguous dimension, then it turns out that men are more likely to negotiate or start a negotiation than women. Okay? And very recently there is a paper, a lab experiment, a clean lab experiment that tries to really identify this gender difference in the preference for starting a negotiation. Okay? They have a very simple employer-employee setting in which they do a real effort task, and then they have to negotiate over a salary, and the starting salary is randomly chosen, okay, randomly set, such that it's the worker's contribution plus a random shock with its negative expected value. And they do find that women are actually less likely to negotiate the starting salary than men, okay? So what about not gender differences in preferences for bargaining, but what about just the actual differences when bargaining, okay? So think of the competitiveness story. So you can think of the preference for competition and actual differences when performing under competition. So here, let's do the same separation. So let's separate between the preferences of starting a negotiation or actually bargaining and the differences once everybody is forced to do it, okay? So in that sense, there are some studies, important studies, that use the following techniques. So at the end of the day, the goal was to identify some type of discrimination behavior from proposers, from dealers, okay? And in that sense, this idea is take two people, men and women, black or white, and make them as equal as possible, okay? So train them, give them a script such that they come across with exactly the same strategies and with exactly the same bargaining situation, okay? The idea is that if they get different offers, it's because of their different gender or they're different in race, okay? Recently, there is also a work that looks at two surveys in Sweden, looking at posted wage bids and also the offers that they got, and they do find some gender differences. And looking at the laboratory, this is the line started by Catherine Eckel some years ago, and it's kind of restrictive in the following way. So when they're talking about gender differences in bargaining, they only look at the ultimatum game. And the ultimatum game, if you think about it, is a very restrictive way of looking at bargaining. There is almost no bargaining, okay? Because the only thing that the responder can do is basically say yes or no, okay? So it's a really limited vision or version of that, okay? And there is only, as far as we know, there is only one laboratory experiment that actually look at gender differences in alternating offer, which has a little bit of richer structure and gives you a little bit of a better flavor of what's going on, okay? So that long introduction was just to say that maybe gender differences in bargaining and gender differences in preferences for bargaining is starting to be promising and starting to be being studied. But I believe, and so basically I believe that there are three underexplored issues. And those are going to be the ones that I'm going to be talking about here, and those are going to be the ones that we are going to try to fill in, okay? So the very first question, underexplored issue is, should we limit to gender differences, or should we really look also to gender interaction effects, okay? And I'll be very clear about what I mean. The second issue is, a lot of the focus has been given to gender differences in general when looking at the aggregate outcome, bargaining outcomes, okay? And what we mean by aggregate outcomes is, for example, whether the negotiation reached or not, so whether there was an agreement or not, and also the split of the pie, okay? But what about the mechanism? What about the actual bargaining environment, okay? So what about offers, probabilities of acceptance, or demands, okay? So what about the underlying mechanism, okay? And the third one is going to be, well, I think there should be more exploitation of the role asymmetries in bargaining, okay? So start with a symmetric bargaining situation, but symmetric bargaining situations, I would say, are kind of the exception. I mean, the actual bargaining, many times there is a lot of asymmetries going on, okay? And I will be very clear about what I mean by these asymmetries. So, this is just to illustrate the difference between pure gender differences or like gender interaction effects. And the one with the ponytail is not Manuel Bagüez. It's supposed to be a woman, okay? So should we really, so if we really talk about gender differences, pure gender differences, then it's like having a wall. It's having like a blind negotiation. It's like it shouldn't matter who you are bargaining with, okay? And if we think about gender interaction effects, if we really think that the actual characteristics of the bargaining partner matter, then this wall should be broken, okay? So think of your own negotiations. I think nowadays there is a lot of negotiation going on by email, okay? Not maybe that much, at least in my experience, right? But still, you know who you are talking to. Okay, so I think you have very much in mind the characteristics of the person with whom you are negotiating, okay? So if we really have to break this wall and talk about interaction effects, then what we're really talking about is all these interactions. So maybe it's not about men and women behaving differently when bargaining. Maybe it's men when negotiating with women and the other way around, okay? So we should really distinguish between gender differences and gender interaction effects, and that means that we have to really talk about maybe men negotiating with men, mixed gender negotiations, and women negotiating with women, okay? And if, going back to the literature that I just mentioned, when looking at the preference for negotiating or starting a negotiation, no paper looks at the gender interaction effect, and only very few papers look at gender interaction effects when talking about gender differences when bargaining. So many times, this is easy to understand why. Think of many situations in the field, either there is enough variation in one of the bargaining positions, or that the experimenter did not really observe the bargaining or the gender of the bargaining partner, okay? So I think we should really consider both, okay? Gender differences are important, but maybe especially in this particular setting in bargaining, gender interaction effects also should be really looked at. The second thing that I think has been underexplored is that many times when talking about gender differences, we only look at gender differences in terms of, or gender interaction effects, in terms of what I call aggregate bargaining outcomes, which is whether there was an agreement or not, okay? Did they reach an agreement or not? Or how was the pie split? Okay? But maybe, these are also important, but maybe in order to understand how we found these actual differences, it's important also to look at the whole bargaining environment. This means to be able to observe offers, demands, and probabilities of accepting. Okay? So I would say that maybe we have to really make the bargaining environment, from the perspective of the experimenter, a little bit more richer, okay? And finally, what about symmetric and asymmetric bargaining situations? So I think Pedro told me it might not be clear, so this guy on the right is a little bit bigger, meaning that he is more powerful, okay? So symmetric bargaining situations somehow are very easy to solve, or are they have a very salient outcome. Okay? If it's all totally symmetric, we expect also a very symmetric outcome in terms of, for example, the share of the pie. Okay? Now, many bargaining situations are very asymmetric. Okay? And this could be because there is bargaining power differences. Okay? And when I talk about bargaining power, it's basically that the cost of saying no or the cost of not reaching an agreement is very different from one part than the other part. Okay? It could be an informational asymmetry. Maybe one part knows exactly the pie to be shared and the other one doesn't. Okay? Or it could be entitlement. Okay? So if you think of a more psychological element such as your contribution to the actual creation of the pie, and you know exactly the entitlement, maybe this also brings some asymmetries into the table when bargaining. Okay? So I could think, or we can think of these three elements, but maybe there are more that can make a bargaining situation very asymmetric. Okay? So of course, when we look at gender differences and gender interaction effects, then the question here is whether men and women react differently to these asymmetries. Okay, or when these asymmetries exist. Okay, okay. So this was kind of an introduction to my talk. So the idea after all this introduction is that what I would like to do is talk about a completed paper that addresses some of these issues that I mentioned. Okay, this is a completed paper by Inigo and myself. So women ask for less only from men, evidence from an alternating offer bargaining in the field. And then I would like to also take the opportunity to throw some ideas of some current experiments going on in order to address some of these underexplored issues. Okay, so that's the idea. So let me talk about this completed paper that uses data from the field, and this is called Women Ask for Less, Only from Men. And maybe you know this is a TV show that was broadcast in 2013, in the summer of 2013, and it was broadcast in the Cuatro, and it was called Negocia como puedas, okay? So bargain as you can. And we thought that this offered quite a unique setting in which we, in that particular case, could really observe not only bargaining outcomes, but the whole bargaining process because of how the TV show occurred. And the main advantages on top of that is that there is enough variation on both sides of the bargaining partner. So there is in the proposer side and in the responder side, there are this enough variation of gender. But also the pies are on average quite high. Okay, so if you want to do something like that in the lab, well, you will end up with quite very few observations because it's quite expensive to have a pie of €300 on average, okay? So these are the main advantages. And the nice thing also was that, so the whole negotiation was recorded, so we could really see back and forth how people actually negotiated. There was a limited time, 3 minutes, and when seeing the show, there was no really cuts, okay? So we could really see the negotiation, okay? So let me explain the main features of the TV show. So the participant is endowed with some money, and this money could be 100, 300, 600, or 1,600. Most of the time it was between 100 and 300, okay? And is asked a very general culture question, okay? So this was very easy question, okay? There is no, so 86% of the time it was correct, okay, the answer. So that was not really the main thing of the TV show. The thing is that if I am asked this question, I cannot provide the answer myself even if I know the answer, but I have to look in the street for a person that would answer that question for me, okay? So basically I'm given 3 minutes and I start running and looking for people, okay? When I find somebody, I ask the question, I make sure that he or she knows the answer, and then I say, okay, if I agree, I will buy the answer from you. Okay? And during these 3 minutes, all this negotiation goes on. Okay? So, within these 3 minutes, if the agreement is reached, then the agreement is realized. Okay? The payments are done and they're done. Okay? Now, if they don't, both get 0. Okay? And within the 3 minutes, this is what is going on. And you can see, we can observe the outcomes, we can see also how the negotiation occurred, and so on and so forth, okay? So in the typical round, the proposer, what we call the participant, the one who is looking for a responder, starts usually with an offer. The other person says yes or no. If it's a no, then makes a counteroffer and keeps going like that, one after the other. So it's kind of close to the alternating offer until an agreement is reached or until the 3 minutes limit is reached. Okay? So these are the main characteristics. We argue, and I think it's pretty clear, that this bargaining setting is very asymmetric in all the 3 dimensions that I mentioned, actually. So on the one hand, only the proposer knows the pie, how much money there is to share, not the responder. So there is an informational asymmetry and makes the proposer a stronger position. Also, there is bargaining power, bigger bargaining power of the proposer, because within the 3 minutes, if the proposer sees that the negotiation is taking too long or this person is being too difficult, the proposer can always say, I dropped you and I look for somebody else within the 3 minutes. Okay? But again, this potential responder can be dropped and the proposer can look for somebody else. Okay? And finally, in terms of entitlement, I think this is less clear, but I think there is some reason to think that maybe the proposer is also more entitled because he or she is the participant, and the other person is somebody that the proposer approaches in the street. Okay? So in that sense, and thinking of an experimental design, this is not ideal because the 3 types of asymmetries happen exactly at the same time. So ideally, we like to disentangle among the 3, but this is not possible, okay? But this is only to say that this shows a really highly asymmetric bargaining situation, okay? So in terms of data, we end up with 428 different negotiations. 377 end up in agreement, okay? So only 12% of disagreement. And this data is coming from 134 proposers and 428 responders. So as you can see, the same responder can be matched with different responders. Okay? So it's kind of an interesting data set. Okay? So if you think, as I do many times, an experimentalist, it's not easy to find this type of data in the lab. Okay? Or do need a lot of money. Okay? So what we do is basically we look at what we call aggregate outcome variables, but also to the actual bargaining. When we look at aggregate outcome variables, we look at 3 outcome variables, whether an agreement was reached or not, 0, 1, okay? How much money or how the pie was shared, okay? And also how long it took, okay? Because many times they don't exhaust the 3 minutes, okay? They end up much before, okay? So how much time it took, okay? The number of rounds, how much back and forth goes on in the negotiation. But also after looking or starting with these aggregate outcomes, we also look at actual offers, probabilities of saying yes or no, demands, and so on and so forth. And I think this is very illuminating, at least in our particular case, okay? And then, of course, we want to control as much as possible with all the characteristics. And here, from the TV show, we get, in terms of the proposers, we get gender, occupation, and age. And for the responder side, we only get the gender because we see the gender, okay? But regarding attractiveness, perceived status, and also the age of the responder, what we do is, given we have all the footage of the TV show, we hire independent raters, and we ask them to rate all these candidates according to these 3 dimensions. So we have at least some control over these aspects that we think are important, especially attractiveness, okay? So maybe there is all this evidence that maybe attractive people get better deals, okay? So this is the data. So what we find is that, well, in terms of the probability of reaching an agreement, or the duration of the negotiation, we don't find neither gender differences or interaction effects, nothing, okay? But in terms of how the money is split, okay, so how much money the proposer is getting and how much money the responder is getting, and looking particularly at the proposer's outcome, we find that we don't find gender differences, but we find that one particular matching is the only one that is different, okay? And this is the one where we have a male proposer negotiating with a female responder. Okay? This is the only one that is different from the three combinations, out of the four combinations, okay? So in particular, what we find is that this is the worst matching for a woman, and this is the best matching for a man, okay? So male proposers earn 2.8% more when facing a female responder, and female responders earn 21% less when facing a male proposer. This difference between responders and proposers is because in this asymmetric situation, the proposer is getting much more than the responder. Okay, so the same amount yields different percentages. Okay, but this is the only one different. Okay, so of course, if we stop there, we don't know whether this is coming because maybe men propose differently to women, or maybe women have different probabilities of saying yes or no, or maybe when making a counteroffer, maybe women actually are the ones that make a different counteroffer when facing a man. Okay? So that's why we think it's important not only to look at these aggregate outcomes, but illuminate these aggregate outcomes with what's going on during the negotiation. And of course, during the negotiation, the difficult part is that what is really exogenous. Okay, so here, the very first thing that is exogenous is really an initial offer. Everything that comes later will be most likely influenced by the initial offer. Okay? When we look at the initial offers, we don't find anything. No gender differences, no interaction effects. Okay? What we find is that in the demand side, it is women who demand much less when facing only a man. Okay? So that's why the title, Women Ask for Less, but only when they are really facing a man. Okay? So that's why it's important to look at both really outcomes. Okay? But remember, we already said that the proposer's side is much stronger than the responder's side. So we really are looking at a symmetric situation in which the strong position is held by men and the weaker position is held by women. Okay? And it is the women in the weak position that when they actually ask less from men. Okay? Of course, here ideally, the three asymmetries that I told you about are playing a role. We don't know exactly which one is the relevant one. Okay? So limitations of this study, and I'm sure you are thinking of many, and let me just mention some. Of course, how representative is this? Okay? Every time you analyze or use data from a TV show, there is all these questions about how representative these individuals are. Here, selection can go in actually two directions, right? I'm not going to participate in a TV show like that. Maybe some of you are going to participate, not me. But I'm not representative either, okay? But clearly, there are some social cues that are more likely to participate in these particular types of settings. Also, the TV show probably doesn't want a candidate like me. Maybe it wants somebody who is going to be funnier and maybe, show different behavior. Okay, so the selection goes in both ways. Okay. Also, keep in mind that maybe people, this behavior that we observe, they know that they're being observed. Okay, they know that they're being on a TV show. Okay, and maybe this makes them behave differently. I'm not sure how this would influence differently men and women, okay? And especially under 3 minutes stress in which maybe you don't have that much time to really think about, okay? But still, these are important concerns on how much you should really take out from here, okay? The second thing that is really more worrying is that ideally, again, if you think of as an experimentalist, you don't want people to select their bargaining partners, okay? You want to have random matching such that you can guarantee that those that are being selected by men and by women are really comparable, okay? In this particular setting, I don't know if you remember, but it is the proposers who really select responders, okay? So ideally, this is a big limitation, okay? So what do we do in that aspect particularly? I think what we can do is two things. One is, given we have all these observables, okay, see whether women selected by men are somehow different from women selected by women, okay? At least in observables, we don't find significant differences in those aspects. And then we also do propensity score matching. So basically, we do regression on a match sample. We take the treatment as being a female responder, and then using a probability score matching, we match these female responders to male responders on observables again. okay? The results are robust to that, okay? But again, this limitation should be kept in mind. Okay, so that said, I will like to move to something that we are working on currently, and again, goes in the direction of filling these gaps in the three aspects that I mentioned, okay? So what we do is that the idea is to study gender differences and gender interaction effects in bargaining, or when bargaining, using experimental methods, okay? So let's be experimentalist and design something in order to address and analyze these effects, okay? And here I think there are three challenges. One is gender interaction. If you really want to look at gender interaction, for sure you want to make gender information available to all parties, okay, in the bargaining, and this is not trivial, okay? So how should you inform subject about the gender of their bargaining partners? You will see what we do. Then the second question is how much of a structure do we need in these bargaining settings? And the idea is that let's not only look at bargaining outcomes in the aggregate level, whether the agreement was reached or not, and the actual split of the pie, but we also want to look at the actual offers and demands, okay? If you want to do that, then you cannot really use an open chat and just ask them to bargain over something because you don't get to observe the data. Okay, so you need to impose a little bit of a structure, and this is what we do. Okay? And the third thing, and this is the main treatment variable that we are going to exploit, is let's start from a totally symmetric bargaining situation, and we know what to expect there, especially in the lab. Okay? If it's all symmetric, I think 50-50 split is so salient, so focal, that it's really hard to get away from that. Okay? Now, having that setting as a control, as a benchmark, then let's introduce different types of asymmetries and see whether gender differences and gender interaction effects emerge within these asymmetric bargaining settings. Okay? So that's the idea. So the main features, so we have run some sessions actually last November. So this is all very new and very preliminary, but the main design, the main features of the design are already determined, okay? So we are going to first ask them to do a real effort task. Men and women are going to perform a real effort task, okay, during certain time, and this is going to be afterwards determining the pie to be shared, okay? So there will be some real effort tasks that will determine their contributions, okay? We are not going to give them any feedback. Okay? This, as you will see in the entitlement, could be something that could be changed, okay, and will be changed. But in the control, no feedback about how well they did. The second thing is that we are going to, after they have done this real effort task, we are going to take them and randomly match in different partners, okay, in different bargaining partners, okay? And they will have to bargain over a sum of money. Okay? How are we going to determine the sum of pi? The idea is that we are going to do random matching. We are going to rank all the couples or matches from lowest to highest, and we are going to set this way different types of pies. Okay? Low, intermediate, and high. Okay? This is all public knowledge. Okay? And finally, let's use the lab in order to elicit measures that will use or will be used as controls in order to be able to say whether they are important or not, okay? And in that aspect, I think there are important risk preferences. So we are going to elicit incentivized risk preferences for both men and women. Also, we are going to elicit, for example, social preferences that might be important in bargaining settings, confidence. And one thing that we actually do is also asking them what they think about the task, whether it's more female and male, but also about the bargaining abilities, you know, how confident or how much confidence they have in their bargaining abilities, and whether they have any preconceived ideas about other people's bargaining abilities, okay? So how do we inform subjects about the bargaining partner of their, of the gender of their bargaining partner? And here, the thing that we chose very neutral gender avatars. Meaning neutral because they have no face, okay? So one cannot be nice, smiling, or like looking aggressive, okay? They have no face. But it's clear that when we ask them, please, which is your gender, they have to choose one, okay? So men choose men, and this we check. And women choose women, okay? so far in the sessions, at least we have done, people respect their own gender, okay? And then we use these avatars to inform them in their negotiation stage, okay? So in this is a screen of the negotiation stage. Here it says you are participant A, and the other guy is participant B. And in this case, me, if I am a participant A, I know that I am negotiating with a man, okay? So of course, if you are thinking of experimental demand effects, this is an important concern, and this is something that we have to measure and see how it affects, okay? But this is how we basically inform subject about the gender of their bargaining partner. And this is important if we really don't want to limit ourselves to look only bargaining outcomes, bargaining gender differences, but also gender interaction effects, okay? The second thing is that I already mentioned how there is a dilemma on how much structure to put in, okay? And this is depending on how much you want to observe and how much data you want to really get a hand on, okay? So in that case, we do really want to have some information on the offers and the probabilities of acceptance and the actual or the counter offers, okay? And this is the type of screen or negotiation screen that they use, okay? So here, for example, if I am a participant A, I started also, and the pi is 5. This is for the control. Everything is known and everything is symmetric. So the pi is 5, and I have no idea what my contribution was. I have no idea what my partner's contribution was. So I think it's pretty clear that, or at least I would say that the most expected outcome is that we split the 5 between equally, okay? So here, the participant A started offering demanding 4 for himself and for herself, and offering 1 to the participant B. This was rejected. And then it was participant B who made an alternative offer. This was again rejected. And they kept like this going on. And now it's my turn. And given I rejected the last offer, then I say it's my turn to make a counter offer. Okay, so it is restrictive in somehow. It's not open chat in which I can negotiate freely, but this gives me, as an experimenter, a little bit of basically information to use afterwards, okay? So, and finally the treatments, and I think this is very important, and this is the main thing that we are going to do, and we have started doing it, but we are not done. So think of the asymmetric, think of the very symmetric bargaining situation. Here it's clear that the salient option is that we split the whole thing equally, okay? And I think this has been shown also in many other settings. When there is no asymmetries, I mean, it's so focal that people actually coordinate on that, okay? And this would be the expected thing. And then we want to introduce asymmetries. As I said, the asymmetries could be in terms of information. Maybe one side knows much more than the other side. It could be in terms of bargaining power. Maybe the cost of rejecting an offer is much higher for one side than the other, okay? And it could be entitlement, okay? So if we play around saying, well, maybe in the control we don't say anything, but in the treatment we say, look, I mean, you have contributed much more than the other guy, and this is public knowledge, then you really get away from this 50-50, because now this is not focal or salient anymore, okay? So I will give you a little bit of flavor of 2 pieces of evidence on the results. I hope you're not disappointed, because I'm going to basically show you something on the control and something on one of the asymmetries, which is the bargaining power that we have exploited, okay? And this is really raw data, okay? So look at the results on proposers' share, okay? The one on the left is what happens in the control, and then the one on the right is in the treatment in which there is we call empowerment, because one side, especially the proposer side, is really empowered in the sense that it has a bigger bargaining power than the responder side, okay? So as expected, in the control, 50-50 split is really salient, okay? So that's what we had in mind. And there is almost no difference in the gender, no gender differences, no interaction effects, okay? So maybe male get a little bit bigger share, but this is not significantly different, okay? So really there is no gender difference, no interaction effect. Now look at empowerment. So in the empowerment, the proposer side is really empowered, okay? In the sense that has a higher bargaining power than the responder side. Here, as it looks at the proposer share, one thing that we see is that from the control, again, people exploit the bargaining power. Okay? They get a bigger share. That's good news. Okay? Now, if you look at the gender differences or gender interaction effect, it's one matching again that looks to be different from the rest. Okay? And this is the one by female empowered and male not powered. Okay? Now, if we stopped here, we would be wondering whether this is coming from initial offers or demands or probabilities of accepting. And let me show you that basically looking at the proposers' opening demands, okay, and this is really exogenous because this is the very first thing that they get, okay? And the second one is the first demand. So after you get an offer, you probably said no, and then the first demand that I do, okay? So surprise, surprise, in the control, and that's also important to look at the dynamics, right? In the control, men start always asking more than the 50%, okay? Not the women. But in the dynamics of the bargaining, they don't get it. It's kind of neutralized, okay? So two things. First, in the control, there is a pure gender difference. Men start actually demanding more for themselves, but this is not really what is translated into the outcome, okay? And the second thing is that in the empowerment, we see that this is really coming from the proposer's initial offers. Women, when facing a man, they start demanding less. And again, this is the only one that is different. In the demand side, we don't find any really important interaction effects. Again, we see a little bit of a gender effect maybe. Males actually, maybe they like negotiating more, I don't know. But they demand also more than women. But the one that is different is male, female, and the one that, and this difference is coming from initial offers, okay? So I think I will stop here. So let me conclude saying that the few studies that had the opportunity and really looked at gender differences and gender interaction effects in bargaining show that not only gender differences are important, but especially in bargaining, maybe gender interaction effects should be really looked at. And I think that, or what we like to go is in three directions. So basically test for these gender interaction effects and gender differences and see whether they are relevant or not. Have a rich enough bargaining structure such that we don't only look at the outcomes, but try to understand where this or how this outcome can be really explained through the demands or the offer side. And also make these bargaining situations a little bit more realistic in the sense that many times they are asymmetric, okay? So given the information, given the bargaining power, given the entitlement, there are some asymmetries, and see how the gender effects and the gender interaction effects actually interact in these asymmetric positions in bargaining. So thank you very much.
Okay. I think we have still a few minutes for questions, so please, there's one over there.
Thank you very much for a great talk and for identifying all these different issues to be tackled in bargaining. I was just wondering, because you talk about how we identify differences in women's and men's behavior, so women might be demanding less in some situations and so on. I just wonder what the next step would be, and if you are thinking about addressing that. In particular, there's a literature showing that women might be demanding less because they actually are perceived differently than men if they demand a lot. So I wonder what you think about this, and if we should be concerned about highlighting these differences in how women and men behave, because this could potentially lead to differences in people's opinion about what is acceptable behavior. I just wonder what you think about these issues.
So I think you are thinking of the backlash situation, so maybe the perception would be different afterwards. I think in that sense, our elicitation of all these measures that we do at the very end, looking at, for example, risk preferences, confidence, what they expect about social preferences, for example, about men and women, or what they expect about confidence, or even bargaining abilities about men and women, would be very interesting to look at in order to disentangle what is driving all these things. But for now, what we are doing in that respect is looking at all these elicited measures that we have at the very end of the bargaining. So after the bargaining stage is done, looking at all these potential behavioral differences in confidence, perceptions, even the actual gender nature of the task, because maybe they believe that they are in a task that maybe men are better and therefore they should get more. Okay, so all these things will be, I think, important in identifying the underlying mechanism.
One last very brief question, if any? No?
So I was very curious about whether people are taking this into account when they choose who they want to negotiate with. So in the TV show, I guess you can observe whether men are more likely to look for women to negotiate. And I was wondering whether you're planning about doing something in the lab about this, and if we observe any difference, what to make out of that. So if that could reflect some cost of negotiating with the other gender or with the same gender or something like that.
So in the TV show, what happened is that the proposer side was really gender balanced. The responder side was not. There were more men than women. And it turns out that men are actually even more likely to choose men than women. Okay? So this is not rational according to the thing, okay? But one thing that we do, for example, remember that they only have 3 minutes to look for somebody. And one determinant of the gender of the opponent is the actual nature of the question. So even under time pressure, or given the time pressure, for example, if there is a question related to sports, automatically they went for a boy. And if, for example, there is something about cooking or fashion, they went for a girl. So this is something that we do in the regression analysis, okay? In the experimental thing, for now, we are really, I think it's an interesting element. So basically, who do you choose to bargain with, okay? And I think their expectations really play a big role. But in reality, you don't really choose many times with whom you bargain, okay? Especially in wage bargaining, you know, there is a person determined there, and you don't really get to choose with whom you bargain with, I think. But I think it's a very interesting research question anyway, so thank you.
So thank you very much. As I anticipated, this has been a great Keynote lecture, despite of being local. So thank you very much.